They said Mrs. Brantley's parlour was the most beautiful in Charleston. Velvet drapes, imported porcelain, a harp no one played. But what made the room famous wasn't the furniture, it was what sat at her feet. A little girl in lace, too small for the chair, too quiet for her age. The mistress fed her sugar from a silver spoon and called her darling pet. And when guests asked who she was, Mrs. Brantley smiled and said, "Oh, just something sweet I found at auction." Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to Charleston, 1839, to the house where beauty was worshipped and humanity was furniture. They called her Minnie because it was easier than saying what she was. She had been born small, small enough that when the traders lifted her from the wagon, the crowd laughed instead of bidding. Someone said she looked like a doll, another said she looked like a mistake. Mrs. Brantley bought her for the price of a dog. The mistress said she wanted something delicate to lighten the room, and that was what Minnie became, a living decoration. She was dressed in lace and soft shoes, placed near the piano or the window, wherever the guests would notice her best. When visitors came, Mrs. Brantley would say, "Isn't she precious?" and feed her sugared almonds from a porcelain bowl, one by one, as though she were feeding a pet. Minnie would open her hand and take them, small and polite, careful not to let her face show the taste of salt. The parlour smelled of roses and starch and wine. No one noticed that she never ate at the table, that she slept beside the fireplace in a basket lined with old quilts, or that her back ached from sitting too straight too long. Mrs. Brantley's husband, Edward, rarely entered the room. When he did, he looked at Minnie as though she were something the house itself had coughed up, but he never said a word. The mistress ran the house like a clock wound too tight, every breath measured, every movement rehearsed. At night, when the guests were gone, the laughter fading down the cobblestone street, Minnie would hear the mistress pacing. Sometimes the sound came close, the click of heels, the soft hiss of silk skirts, then a whisper, "Stand straight." Always straight. Pretty things mustn't look tired. The house servants watched but said nothing. Sarah, the cook, slipped her scraps of bread when she could. Samuel, the boy who cleaned the lamps, once told her, "Don't let her make you forget how to walk." But it was easy to forget. Days folded into weeks. The world beyond the parlour grew small, like a dream she could no longer fit inside. Once, when the mistress hosted a garden party, Minnie was placed outside for the first time. She stood near a fountain, dressed in blue silk, the sun sharp on her skin. The guests smiled, cooed, circled her like she was art. One man asked if she could sing. Mrs. Brantley smiled and said, "She doesn't need to. Her silence is her charm," and Minnie, small and still, felt the words settle over her like dust, soft, suffocating, impossible to shake off. The kitchen sat behind the main house, low-ceilinged, warm, and full of smells that didn't belong to the world upstairs. Minnie liked it there, even though she was not supposed to. The mistress said the smoke made her less presentable, so she went only when she could slip away unnoticed. Sarah, the cook, was the first person who ever spoke to her like she was a person. A wide woman with kind eyes and a tired back, Sarah would hum while stirring pots that never stopped boiling. "You hungry, baby?" she'd ask, not looking up. And Minnie would nod, though she never said a word. The first time, Sarah gave her a biscuit, still hot, edges crisp. Minnie ate it fast, crumbs catching on her dress. Sarah laughed softly. "Slow down, sugar. Ain't no one taking it from you." It became their secret. A stolen piece of bread here, a bit of jam there. The other servants noticed but never told. In a house like the Brantleys, silence wasn't just habit, it was survival. At night, when the laughter and piano music floated down from the parlour, Sarah would tell stories over the fire. Tales from before, from other places, about rivers and skies so wide they had no walls. Minnie would listen, small and cross-legged by the door, trying to imagine what a place like that felt like. A place where you weren't part of someone's furniture. Once she asked, "Sarah, why she keep me there? In that room?" Sarah hesitated, hand stilling over the pot. 'Cause people like her need something smaller than themselves to feel big. Minnie thought about that all night. The next morning, the mistress noticed dirt on her hem. "You've been crawling again," she said. "A lady doesn't crawl." She knelt down, voice syrup-sweet but eyes hard. "You want to be a lady, don't you, Minnie?" Minnie didn't answer. Mrs. Brantley smiled, the kind of smile that only sharpens cruelty. "Then you'll sit in the parlor until you learn how." By evening, Minnie's legs had gone numb. Her stomach growled. She stared at the door, waiting for footsteps that never came. When Edward Brantley came home from town, he stopped in the doorway and frowned. "For God's sake, Ellen, she's a child, not a figurine." "She's mine," the mistress said. "She stays where I put her." He looked at his wife for a long moment, then at Minnie. "Everything in this house is yours, isn't it?" And for a second, just a flicker, the mistress's eyes shifted, not with guilt, but with something closer to fear. That night, Minnie didn't go to the kitchen, but when she lay awake, she could still smell the biscuits, hear Sarah's humming, and feel something begin to stir. Not rebellion yet, but recognition. The first seed of a truth she'd soon come to understand. There are cages you can't see until you stop calling them home. Edward Brantley began to notice her after that night, not as his wife's plaything, but as something else. At first, it was guilt that drew his eyes. He'd see Minnie sitting in that stiff chair, her hands folded, eyes lowered, as if she were trying to disappear inside herself. There was no movement in her except her breath, small and shallow. He started leaving the parlor door open when he passed by, pretending it was by mistake. Sometimes he'd find an excuse to linger, to adjust the curtains, to pour another drink, to drop a coin he never picked up. Minnie would look up only once, briefly, then go still again. She didn't trust him, not yet. She knew the house was a stage, and everyone inside it a role they hadn't chosen. One evening, when Mrs. Brantley was hosting her women's circle upstairs, Edward found Minnie by the window. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the gardens outside. He stopped in the doorway and said softly, "Do you ever go out there?" She didn't answer. He tried again. "You should." "It's only flowers." Minnie's voice, when it came, startled them both. "Flowers die in vases, sir." Edward froze. He hadn't heard her speak before, not in words meant for anyone but the mistress. Her voice was small, but there was something in it that felt unafraid. He set his drink down. "Who told you that?" "No one. I just watched." The words hung in the room like the echo of a truth too fragile to touch. Edward nodded once, then turned away. "Keep watching, Minnie," he said quietly. "It's the only way to stay sane in this house." After that, he spoke to her more often, never long, never enough for the servants to notice. Once he gave her a small book, its cover worn, the pages soft with age. "It's poetry," he said. "You can keep it if you like." Minnie traced the letters on the cover that she couldn't yet read. "The mistress won't like it." "Then don't tell her," he said. "Not everything belongs to her." For the first time she smiled. But secrets, in a house like that, had a way of being overheard. A week later, Mrs. Brantley found the book under Minnie's cushion. She turned it over in her hands, frowning. "Where did this come from?" Minnie hesitated. "It was given." "By whom?" Minnie said nothing. Mrs. Brantley's voice sharpened. "Do you think you can keep things from me?" When she struck her, it wasn't hard. A gloved slap, quick and practiced. But it landed with the weight of years. That night, Minnie didn't cry. She sat by the fire with the book hidden beneath her quilt, the sting on her cheek fading, replaced by something new. Not anger, not even pain. Something colder, something like knowing. For the next few days, the mistress's voice carried through every corner of the house, like the creak of old wood before it breaks. The servants walked lighter, their eyes low. Even the birds outside seemed to avoid the Brantley porch. Mrs. Brantley no longer fed Minnie from her hand. She didn't speak to her either. Instead, she would walk through the parlor and move things, vases, pillows, candles, just to see if Minnie would flinch when the silence broke. She always did. It became a game for the mistress, played with the kind of grace that made cruelty look like etiquette. If Minnie dropped a spoon, she'd say, "A proper lady keeps her balance." If her hands trembled, "Delicate things should be steady." And if Minnie dared to look away, even for a second, she'd murmur, "I see everything in this room." "Everything that's mine," Sarah once told her. "Don't let her get inside your head, baby." But it was already too late. Mrs. Brantley lived there now, in her thoughts, her steps, her posture. One afternoon, Edward came home early. He found his wife sitting with her friends, tea steaming between them. Minnie sat on the floor beside her chair, motionless. One of the ladies asked, "Is that the little thing you told us about?" Mrs. Brantley smiled. "My parlor pet. She keeps me company when Edward's away." The room tittered with laughter, small, rehearsed, like wind chimes in a storm. Edward's jaw tightened. "She's not a pet," he said. The women fell quiet. The mistress's hand froze over her teacup. "You sound as though you care," she said lightly, though her eyes had already darkened. He didn't answer. He left the room without another word, but the silence he left behind was heavier than any argument. That evening, Mrs. Brantley visited the parlor alone. Minnie sat by the window, the poetry book hidden in her lap. The mistress closed the door quietly and stood behind her. "Do you know why my husband looks at you?" she asked. Minnie didn't move. "No, ma'am. Because you remind him of what he wants and can't have." Something small, something that obeys Minnie's throat went dry. "I don't think he—" "Don't think," the mistress cut in. "Pretty things don't think. They reflect." She reached out and touched Minnie's hair. Her fingers moved slow, almost tender, before tightening in a sharp pull. "You belong here. Do you understand?" Minnie nodded. The mistress released her and walked away, whispering as she left, "Good. Stay in the light where I can see you." When the door closed, Minnie stayed still for a long time. The candlelight shimmered on the piano, the only thing in the room that didn't seem afraid. Then she opened the poetry book and traced the words again, her small finger following each letter like a prayer. She didn't know how to read yet, but she was learning to remember. And memory, in a house like this, was the first act of rebellion. Rain came to Charleston the next morning, soft and relentless, soaking the cobblestones until they gleamed like glass. The Brantley house felt heavier when it rained, as though the walls themselves absorbed the damp and sighed. Edward spent most of the day in his study. The servants said he'd been drinking again. He didn't speak to his wife at breakfast, nor at dinner. When he did look at her, it was the way a man looks at a painting he no longer recognizes. Minnie saw it. She saw everything. Mrs. Brantley, on the other hand, acted untouched. She hummed through her chores, gave orders with more sugar than usual, and smiled too wide when she passed the parlor door. Her calm was a kind of punishment, a silence designed to keep everyone guessing when the storm would finally break. That night, Minnie crept to the kitchen for a bit of bread. Sarah was still awake, elbows on the table, hands clasped. She looked up and said softly, "You should be asleep, baby." "I couldn't," Minnie whispered. Sarah sighed and tore a piece from the loaf, pressing it into her hand. "Don't let her see you sneaking. She'll have my hide if she knows you eat down here." Minnie nodded. "I'll be careful." Sarah studied her a moment longer. "You been quiet lately, even for you. You holding too much in that little head of yours." Minnie hesitated. "If I talk, she'll know." Sarah shook her head. "She already knows everything. That's her sickness. People like her don't got nothing left to love but control." Minnie looked at the bread in her hand. "Do you think she was ever small?" Sarah blinked. "What you mean?" "Like me," Minnie said, "before she learned to make people afraid." Sarah's eyes softened. Maybe once. But she didn't stay that way long enough. When Minnie returned to the parlor, Edward was there, sitting in his chair, staring at the fire. He didn't notice her at first. The orange light flickered across his face, making him look older than he was. "You shouldn't be awake," he said quietly. I couldn't sleep. He poured himself another drink, the glass trembling in his hand. Neither can I. She stood near the piano, unsure if she should leave. The sound of rain filled the space between them. After a while, he said, "Do you hate her?" Minnie didn't answer. He nodded slowly. "You should." "I think I do." She looked at him then, not as a child looks at a man, but as one prisoner looks at another. "Then why don't you stop her?" The words startled them both. Edward's lips parted, but no sound came. He just stared at the fire, as if the flames might explain him. "Because," he said finally, "the house listens. And I'm too much a coward to hear what it might say back." Minnie watched him for a long moment, then turned toward the door. Behind her, he whispered, "Keep the book close." And when she glanced back, she saw something flicker across his face. Not kindness, not guilt, but the faintest trace of apology. Outside, thunder rolled far off, low and tired. Inside, the parlor glowed like a cage made of firelight. And Minnie understood something she'd never known before. Sometimes the quietest people aren't afraid to speak. They're just waiting for the right silence to break. By the end of the week, Mrs. Brantley had begun to watch Minnie the way a cat watches something that twitches but won't run. Her eyes followed her through the parlor, over her shoulders, across her hands, as if searching for a secret she couldn't name. The household had grown tense. Sarah moved slower in the kitchen, careful not to draw attention. Samuel avoided the parlor altogether. Even Edward, who once tried to break the silence, now spent his days behind the study door, the smell of whiskey clinging to the air long after he left it. Only Minnie remained in the light. Always in the light. Mrs. Brantley insisted on it. "Sit where the sun reaches you," she'd say in the morning. "I like to see you shine." Minnie obeyed. She sat near the lace-draped windows, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. But she didn't look at the mistress anymore. Not when she entered the room. Not when she spoke. Not even when she brushed past close enough for her perfume to sting the nose. The first time Minnie didn't look up, Mrs. Brantley stopped mid-step. "Did you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then look at me when you answer." Minnie raised her eyes, just barely. Enough to be polite, not enough to submit. The silence that followed stretched like pulled thread. Then the mistress smiled. "Good girl," she said, voice brittle. "Pretty things should never forget who looks at them." But she did not move for a long time. She stood there, staring, her smile trembling around the edges. That night, the mistress ordered the servants to bring Minnie's quilt and basket bed upstairs. "She'll sleep in the parlor again," she said. "I don't like her wandering." Sarah's jaw clenched. "Yes, ma'am." When Minnie returned later, the fire was already lit. The air was too warm, heavy with roses and something sour beneath. Mrs. Brantley sat in her chair, still dressed from supper, her hair pinned high and her face powdered pale. "You've grown quiet," she said. "I don't hear your little hum anymore." "I wasn't aware I hummed." "You did." It was sweet, innocent. The mistress tilted her head, studying her. "You've been speaking to my husband." Minnie froze. "No, ma'am." Mrs. Brantley rose from her chair and walked around her in slow, deliberate circles. The air seemed to bend around the rustle of her dress. "Don't lie to me, child." "I can smell deceit the way dogs smell fear. I'm not lying." "Then why does he look at you like you matter?" Minnie swallowed hard. "Maybe because he knows I don't." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Mrs. Brantley struck her, not out of rage this time, but control, precise as a metronome. "Don't ever speak to me that way again," she said softly. "You'll forget how to talk before I let you forget your place." When the mistress left, Minnie sat in the dim light, her cheek throbbing. She did not cry. She only looked toward the window, where the rain had begun again. For the first time, she wished it would flood, so the water could reach the parlor and wash the light away. For 3 days after the slap, Mrs. Brantley didn't speak to Minnie at all. She would enter the parlor, glide past her, adjust a curtain, pour her tea, and leave again without a word. The silence was not forgiveness. It was a blade turned flat, waiting for the right angle to cut. Minnie sat by the fire, as always. Her cheek had turned faintly yellow where the bruise was healing. Every time she blinked, she could still see the shape of the mistress's ring, small and round, like a brand that didn't burn. Sarah began to visit her more often, under the pretense of dusting. She'd pause beside the chair, pretending to fix a vase or tidy the mantel, and whisper things that were dangerous to say out loud. "She's losing her grip, baby. You keep your head low. She don't like what she can't control. That's her kind of sickness." And once, very quietly, "You ain't hers, no matter what she say." Those words sat with Minnie longer than any slap ever had. That night, as she pretended to sleep in her basket bed by the fireplace, she heard the mistress and Edward arguing upstairs. Their voices were muffled through the walls, but the tones carried, sharp, cold, breaking. "You shame yourself," Mrs. Brantley hissed, whispering to her like she's a child, Edward's voice rough with drink. "You treat her like an ornament. She is an ornament. That's all she was ever meant to be." There was a crash, glass or porcelain, something fine shattering against the wall. Then silence. Minnie pulled the quilt tighter around herself. Somewhere deep in her chest, something began to twist, a feeling that wasn't fear, not anymore. Something else. By morning, the house was cold again. The mistress came down for breakfast with her hair immaculate, her hands steady, her face like polished marble. Edward didn't appear. When Mrs. Brantley passed the parlor later that day, she stopped. Minnie was still in her chair, the poetry book open on her lap, her finger tracing letters across the page. "What are you doing?" "Learning," Minnie said softly. Mrs. Brantley blinked. "Learning what?" "How to read." The mistress stared for a moment that stretched too long. "Who taught you?" Minnie's voice didn't waver. "No one." Just watching, Mrs. Brantley's lips parted, but no sound came. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup. Then, without another word, she turned and left. That evening, Sarah found the girl in the kitchen again. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered, glancing toward the door. "She don't take kindly to clever." "I'm not clever," Minnie said, "just tired of being small." Sarah gave her a long look, something between pride and worry. That's how every fight starts. And for the first time, Minnie allowed herself to imagine it, what it might feel like if the parlor didn't own her anymore. Not freedom, not yet. But the thought of it, that was the first crack in the walls. And cracks, in houses like this, don't stay small for long. Charleston's air was thick with heat and gossip the night Mrs. Brantley decided to host her spring soiree. The invitations had been sent weeks before, back when her social standing was still a subject of admiration and envy. But now the house buzzed with a quieter energy, the kind born of strain, not celebration. The servants worked without speaking. Silver was polished until it caught the candlelight like fire. The carpets were beaten, the piano tuned. Every sound in the house felt like a warning. Minnie was dressed early. The mistress chose her gown herself, pale cream lace with a blue ribbon that bit into her shoulders. "You'll sit by the window tonight," she said, fastening the bow with deliberate care. "Our guests enjoy seeing you there." "You make the room—" "Charming. Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Brantley's eyes lingered on her. "And you'll be silent." Smiles, not words. "You remember how to behave." "Yes, ma'am." When the first guests arrived, the parlor filled with perfume and laughter. Women in silk fanned themselves near the doorway. Men spoke too loudly about crops and trade and politics. Mrs. Brantley moved through them like a swan, all grace and gleam, her voice smooth enough to hide the crack beneath. Minnie sat by the window, just as she'd been told. The world outside looked blurred, washed in the reflection of candlelight and motion. She felt like she was watching life through glass, trapped between what was real and what was performed. Across the room, Edward stood by the piano, his glass half empty, his eyes far away. Every so often he would look toward Minnie, not in pity, not even in guilt. Something quieter, recognition perhaps, of how small dignity can look when it's trying to survive. Mrs. Brantley noticed. Of course she did. She always noticed. Near the end of the evening, one of the guests, a man from Savannah with a smile that dripped arrogance, nodded toward Minnie and said, "I've never seen one so perfect." "Does she talk?" Mrs. Brantley's fan paused mid-air. "Not unless spoken to." The man chuckled. "Good training." A ripple of polite laughter followed, shallow and cruel. Edward's hand tightened around his glass until the rim cracked. Minnie looked up then, not at the man, but at the mistress. Their eyes met across the room. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of them, caught in that gaze, the woman who owned her and the child she couldn't quite erase. Then Minnie did something she had never done before. She stood. The conversation faltered. The music stuttered. Every face turned. Minnie's voice was small, steady. "Would you like me to sing, ma'am?" The room went still. Mrs. Brantley's lips parted, a dozen thoughts flickering behind her eyes. "No," she said finally. "I think you've been seen enough for one night." But the damage was done. The silence that followed wasn't polite anymore. It was uneasy, the kind that grows teeth. Minnie sat again, calm, her hands folded once more in her lap. But inside, she felt something like air after a storm, raw, sharp, and alive. And upstairs, where the cracks in the ceiling met like veins, the house itself seemed to listen. The night after the soiree, the Brantley house went still. The laughter that had filled the parlor seemed to hang in the curtains, faint and stale, as if even it had realized it wasn't welcome anymore. Guests left whispering, not about the food or the music, but about the girl, the small one by the window, the one who stood. By morning, Charleston was already repeating the story. How Mrs. Brantley's little pet had spoken in front of company, how she'd risen like a child who forgot her training, how Edward Brantley hadn't moved to stop her. Rumors in Charleston were like humidity, invisible but impossible to escape. Inside the house, Mrs. Brantley moved with perfect calm. She didn't shout. She didn't slap. She didn't even look at Minnie. She simply began to erase her. The parlor chair was gone by noon, the lace dress by evening. Minnie was ordered to stay in the servants' quarters, away from the guests, away from sight. "She needs time to remember what she is," the mistress told Sarah. Minnie didn't argue. She just nodded and went where she was told. But that night, when Sarah brought her supper, she found the girl sitting at the small table by the window, staring out into the dark yard. "She's scared," Sarah whispered. "Not of you. Of what people might say." Minnie turned to her. "They were already saying it. I just made them hear it louder." Sarah smiled faintly. "You got her rattled, that's for sure. Never seen her so quiet. Never seen him so drunk. Is he angry?" "Edward?" Sarah shrugged. "At himself, maybe. But men like him don't fight. They just fade." The next afternoon, Mrs. Brantley sent for Edward. They shut the door to the study, but their voices leaked through the walls. Minnie could hear her tone, smooth, brittle, too calm to be anything but dangerous. "You've humiliated me," the mistress said. "You've made a fool of this house." "You did that yourself," Edward answered. A pause, then the sound of something breaking, a decanter, maybe. "You think that little thing matters?" she spat. "She's nothing." "Then why does she frighten you?" No answer. Just the slow, shaky exhale of a woman who'd just realized something she didn't want to know. That night, Mrs. Brantley came to the servants' quarters with a lantern. She didn't speak to Minnie. She didn't need to. She stood in the doorway, her shadow spilling long across the floor. Then she said softly, "I want the book." Minnie held it close to her chest. "It's not yours." The mistress smiled, but her eyes were hollow. "Everything in this house is mine." Minnie didn't move. She didn't even blink. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them did. Then Mrs. Brantley turned and left, the lantern's light shrinking with each step until only the dark was left. Sarah found Minnie still sitting there hours later, the book open in her lap, her face unreadable. "She'll come again," Sarah whispered. "I know," Minnie said quietly, "but next time I'll be ready." Mrs. Brantley did not sleep that night. She walked the upstairs hall in slow, deliberate steps, her nightgown whispering against the wood floor. The lantern she carried threw long, trembling shadows over the wallpaper. The same pale blue flowers that had once seemed soft now looked like something strangled. Below her, the house was silent. Edward had gone to the study again, the sound of glass clinking echoing faintly through the floorboards. Minnie lay awake on her cot in the servants' quarters, the poetry book pressed to her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mistress's face, not angry, not wild, but blank. The kind of blank that comes before something worse. By dawn, the air in the house felt wrong. The servants spoke in whispers. Sarah's hands shook as she poured coffee, and even Samuel forgot to hum. Everyone knew the quiet in that house was about to end. Mrs. Brantley entered the parlour after breakfast, still in her robe, her hair unpinned. "Fetch her," she told Sarah. "Ma'am, she's not—" "Fetch!" When Minnie was brought in, the mistress stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel as though to steady herself. "You think you've grown clever," she said. "You think because you've learned a few words and found pity in my husband's eyes that you can speak." Minnie's voice trembled, but not with fear. "I don't need pity." "No," the mistress said, smiling faintly. "You need correction." She crossed the room slowly and opened the drawer of a small cabinet near the piano. Inside was a silver brush, heavy, engraved, beautiful. "My mother used to say that the only way to teach grace is through pain." Minnie's heart pounded, but she didn't step back. "Your mother was wrong." The mistress froze. It wasn't the words themselves. It was that Minnie had spoken them, calmly, clearly, without flinching. Something cracked then, though no one saw it. The mistress's control, long and polished as marble, began to splinter. She dropped the brush. It hit the floor with a sharp clang that seemed to echo through the house. Edward appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Ellen," he said quietly. She turned to him, voice shaking. "You've ruined her. You've let her forget what she is." He took a slow step forward. "She's what you made her." For a moment neither spoke. The fire popped between them, sending up a brief spark that vanished in the air. Then Mrs. Brantley did something no one expected. She laughed. Softly at first, then louder, her voice breaking into something that didn't sound like laughter at all. When it faded, she looked back at Minnie. "Then you can have her," she said. "You can both live in your little world of pity and poetry. But remember, child, everything that grows in this house dies in it too." She walked out, her robe trailing like a veil, leaving the smell of roses and ashes behind. Edward stood still for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "Pack your things." Minnie looked up. "Where would I go?" "Anywhere," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just not here." Outside, the wind began to rise, and for the first time in her life, Minnie felt the house tremble. Minnie didn't move. The words, "Pack your things," hung in the air like a lie no one wanted to test. Edward stood there, shoulders heavy, the smell of whiskey clinging to him like guilt. His eyes weren't on her. They were on the window, on the rain that had started to fall again. "You can't stay here," he said. "She'll destroy you if you do." Minnie's voice came out small, calm. "She already has." He winced, maybe because he knew it was true, maybe because it was the same truth that chained him to that house. By the time dawn rose, he had found her a dress, a pair of shoes that didn't fit, and a small sack of food from the kitchen. Sarah helped her tie it closed. Her hands shook the whole time. "You sure you want this, baby?" Sarah asked. "There ain't much kind waiting for you out there." Minnie nodded. "There's less kind in here." Sarah leaned close, whispering, "You keep north in your head. Don't stop walking till your shadow gets small behind you." When Edward came down from the study, he looked different, sober, but not steady. "She's asleep," he said quietly. "Now's the time." The house was silent as they crossed it. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, soft and slow, like sighs from the dead. Minnie didn't look back. She didn't want to see the parlour again, the velvet drapes, the chair by the window where she'd learned to sit still. At the door, Edward paused. "You'll head towards Somerville. There's a woman there who—" "I'll find my own way," Minnie interrupted. He looked down at her, his jaw tight. "You're braver than me." She shook her head. "No, just smaller. You get to hide behind your size." He almost smiled. "Almost. Go before I change my mind." Minnie stepped into the night. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and camellias. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel like a cage. She made it as far as the gate before she heard it, a sound she knew too well, heels on the wood floor, light but fast, Mrs. Brantley's voice, sharp as glass. "Edward!" "Where is she?" Minnie froze. Edward didn't answer. The mistress appeared at the top of the stairs, her nightdress trailing, her hair undone. "You!" she screamed. "You don't leave me! You don't leave my house!" Edward moved between them. "Ellen!" She slapped him hard, once, then again. "You let her walk out like a thief!" Minnie turned and ran, bare feet over gravel, the wind pulling at her hair. Behind her the house came alive, doors slamming, voices shouting. But she didn't stop. She didn't look back. Because the sound of the mistress's scream, that long, broken sound, wasn't just anger. It was fear. And fear, Minnie realized, was the only freedom she'd ever been allowed to give back. The road out of Charleston was narrow and unkind. Roots broke through the mud, and the rain that had soaked the city the night before clung to the earth like memory. Minnie walked barefoot, her shoes tied together and slung over her shoulder. Every few steps, she had to stop to catch her breath. Freedom, she was learning, was not the rush of open gates she'd imagined. It was slower, heavier. It pressed against her ribs the way fear once had. By mid-morning, she reached the marshes. The air was thick with the smell of salt and wet grass. A fisherman's shack stood in the distance, crooked, half-eaten by the tide. Smoke rose from its chimney. Minnie hesitated. She'd been warned all her life about strangers, but she'd already left everything known behind. When she knocked, the door opened a crack. An old black man peered out, eyes sharp and cautious. "You lost, girl?" Minnie swallowed. "Just passing through." He studied her, then stepped aside. "Ain't much here but fish and quiet." "You're welcome to both inside." The air was thick with smoke and warmth. He handed her a tin cup of water, then sat across from her. "Name's Josiah. You got one?" "Minnie." He nodded. "That's a small name for a small thing." She smiled faintly. That's what they used to say. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough of the world to know the look of someone who had left something burning behind. That night, Minnie slept on a blanket by the fire. When she woke, Josiah was already at the river, mending a net. "You keepin' north?" he asked without looking up. She nodded. He grunted. "There's a road past the cypress grove. Keep to it. Don't talk to no patrols. And if you hear dogs, don't run till you have to." Minnie's throat tightened. "You've helped others?" Josiah's hands paused. "Used to. When it mattered. These days I just keep quiet." Before she left, he handed her a small leather pouch. Inside was a piece of bread, a flint, and a rusted coin. "For luck," he said. "I don't believe in luck," she whispered. He smiled sadly. "You will." As she walked away, the wind carried the sound of the sea behind her, steady, endless, free. But freedom, she knew now, wasn't something you reached. It was something you carried, even when it hurt. By nightfall, she reached the old oak line where the fields ended and the road turned to wilderness. She looked back once toward Charleston, its faint lights trembling in the distance like the last breath of something dying. "Let her have the house," Minnie whispered to the dark. "It was never mine to keep." And she kept walking, into the black, into the unknown, each step quieter than the one before, each breath pulling her farther from the cage that once called itself home. For the first time in years, the Brantley parlor was silent. No piano, no chatter, no rustle of skirts, only the faint creak of wood as the house settled into its emptiness. Mrs. Brantley sat in her chair, dressed as though guests might still arrive. The lace collar was pinned too tight at her throat, her hands folded neatly on her lap. But her eyes were fixed on the spot by the window where Minnie used to sit. The servants avoided the room. Even Sarah, bold as she was, stayed clear unless summoned. When she did enter, she kept her gaze low, set the tea tray on the table, and left before the mistress could speak. The whole house seemed to shrink without the girl's presence. The light through the curtains looked weaker, the colours in the furniture dulled. Even the roses outside bloomed unevenly that spring. Edward noticed it too. He stayed out longer, often until the moon was high, returning with whiskey on his breath and the smell of rain on his coat. When he did come home, he no longer argued. He simply drifted through rooms like a ghost, always pausing at the parlour door, but never going in. Mrs. Brantley pretended not to care. "She's gone," she said one evening, when Sarah hesitated with the tea. "Things go missing. It's no tragedy." But later, when she thought no one could hear, she began talking to the empty chair. "You should have stayed," she whispered. "You were safe here." Sometimes she'd pause as if listening for a reply. Then she'd laugh, quietly, bitterly. "Of course you won't answer. I never let you." One night, Edward found her standing by the fireplace, her reflection flickering in the mirror above it. "Ellen," he said gently, "come to bed." She didn't turn. "Do you think she's alive?" He hesitated. "If she's lucky." "Then luck is wasted on her," the mistress said. "She wouldn't know what to do with it." He sighed, but she wasn't finished. "Do you know what they'll say, Edward? That I couldn't keep my own servant, that I let her run wild, let her go," he said quietly. "She was never yours." Mrs. Brantley turned then, slowly, her face pale in the firelight. "You don't understand. I made her what she was. I gave her beauty. I gave her purpose. Without me, she's nothing." Edward's expression hardened. "Then why does it feel like she took the whole house with her?" For a long time, the only sound was the fire cracking behind them. When he finally left the room, the mistress remained by the window, staring out into the night where the fields disappeared into darkness. She thought she saw something move, a small shape walking the edge of the trees. But when she blinked, it was gone. Still, she kept watching, because even in her madness, some part of her understood what pride refused to admit, that the girl she had called pet was the only living thing that had ever made the house feel human. The first weeks on the road blurred into one another, miles of wet fields, the cry of crows at dawn, the smell of pine and mud thick in the air. Minnie followed the direction Sarah had whispered. "Keep north in your head." She slept where she could, under porches, in abandoned sheds beside fallen trees. Every night she'd light a small fire with the flint Josiah had given her, shielding the flame with her hands like it was something sacred. Sometimes she'd whisper to it, as though the light itself could listen. By the time she reached Somerville, her feet were raw, her dress torn at the hem. The town was smaller than she imagined, just a scatter of wooden houses, a church, and a trading post that smelled of tobacco and soap. People stared when she walked through, not cruelly, just curious. She was small, and her steps carried that mix of fragility and purpose that made strangers uneasy. A woman standing by the well called to her. "You look lost, child. You got people here?" Minnie hesitated. "No, ma'am." The woman studied her, the mud on her skin, the steady way she didn't flinch. "Name's Ruth. I keep the laundry down by the river. You hungry?" Minnie nodded. Ruth fed her cornbread and stew that tasted like home. Then she said, "You can stay a while if you help." "Got more clothes than I can scrub before Sunday." For the first time since she'd left Charleston, Minnie smiled. Small, cautious, but real. Days passed in rhythm. Wash, rinse, hang, repeat. Her hands grew rough, her back sore. But the ache felt clean, earned, not inflicted. At night she slept on a cot in Ruth's shed, listening to the river hum. One evening, Ruth came in with a folded newspaper. "You can't read, can you?" "Not yet," Ruth smirked. "Then maybe it's better you don't see what they print in Charleston." Some nonsense about a servant girl gone missing, accused of theft. Minnie's jaw tightened. They always need someone to blame. Ruth nodded. "Ain't that the truth?" She sat beside her. You run from a bad house? Minnie looked toward the door, the darkness outside. I didn't run, she said softly. I walked. Ruth chuckled, not mocking but impressed. You got some iron in you, girl. Keep it quiet, don't let nobody steal it. Minnie didn't answer, but she touched the poetry book hidden beneath her blanket. She still couldn't read most of it, but the words on the page had become like a promise, something waiting for her to grow into. The next morning, when Ruth went to market, Minnie stayed behind to finish the laundry. She was hanging a white sheet to dry when she saw movement at the edge of the trees. A man on horseback, slow and deliberate, eyes scanning the yard. Her breath caught. For a second, she thought it was Edward. Then the man turned and she saw the badge pinned to his vest. A slave catcher. Minnie stepped back, her heart pounding. The book in her pocket felt heavier than iron. And for the first time since she'd left Charleston, she realized freedom was still being followed. The man on horseback stayed at the edge of the trees for a long time, pretending to admire the river. But Minnie knew what kind of man he was. His stillness wasn't peace. It was patience. She ducked behind the hanging sheets, heart pounding. The wind caught the fabric, making them sway like ghosts. She crouched low, clutching the small pouch Josiah had given her. The flint clinked softly against the coin inside, a sound too loud in the quiet. From the yard, Ruth called out, steady but sharp. "You lost, mister?" The man tipped his hat, smiling the way snakes do before they strike. "No, ma'am." "Just looking for someone. Heard tell of a girl came through town. Small thing, light voice, don't belong to nobody." Yet Ruth didn't flinch. "Ain't seen her, but plenty of folks pass through. You got papers saying she's yours?" The man's smile didn't fade. "Don't need papers to spot what don't belong." Ruth's hand tightened on her wash paddle. "Ain't no one belongs to you here." He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the mud. Funny thing about that word, belong. Folks up north like to pretend it don't mean the same thing it always did. Behind the sheets, Minnie pressed a hand to her mouth. The sound of his voice made her skin crawl. Calm, confident, certain. The kind of man who could turn the world cruel just by describing it. "Maybe I'll take a look round your yard," he said. Ruth stepped closer, blocking his path. "Maybe you won't." Their eyes met, her defiance against his authority, until a noise broke the tension. A dog barking from the road. 2 more men appeared behind him, leading a wagon. "Whole lot of company for one runaway," Ruth muttered under her breath. The man smirked. "Ain't run away the word. She was stolen." Minnie felt her stomach twist. Stolen. That was the lie Mrs. Brantley must have spread. Ruth turned her head slightly, just enough for her voice to reach the laundry line. "Run, girl!" Now Minnie bolted. Her feet hit the wet grass, slipping, sliding, but she didn't stop. Behind her came the shouts, men's voices, boots in mud, the crack of a whip cutting through air. She darted through the cypress grove, branches tearing at her dress, water splashing cold against her legs. The sound of horses grew closer, hooves beating like thunder. She dropped the pouch. It hit the mud with a soft thud, spilling the coin and the flint. She almost stopped, but Ruth's voice, faint now, distant, echoed in her head. "Keep north in your head." So she kept running. Through the trees, through the marsh, through the sound of men calling her name like they already owned it. And when she finally broke through the woods, her breath ragged, her legs shaking, she saw something ahead, a church steeple, faint against the grey horizon. For the first time since leaving Charleston, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was bigger than the people who claimed it. The church was small, whitewashed wood with its paint peeling, its bell rusted still. It stood just beyond the marsh, on a patch of high ground that never flooded. Minnie reached it at dawn, her dress torn, her feet bleeding through the soles of her shoes. Inside, the air smelled of old pine and candle wax. A single voice drifted from the front, a woman humming a hymn so low it sounded like a memory. When Minnie stepped in, the woman turned. She was tall, with grey hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and a calm face that looked as though it had seen every kind of sorrow and learned not to fear any of it. "You're early for service," she said softly. Minnie hesitated. "I didn't know there was one." "There isn't," the woman replied. "Not today. But the Lord don't mind surprise visits." Minnie's hands trembled as she held out the small pouch. "I ain't here to pray. I just need somewhere to stop." The woman studied her, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in understanding. "You runnin'?" Minnie nodded once. The woman sighed. "Name's Alma. My husband's the preacher. He's out in the yard, fixin' the fence. You can stay till nightfall. No longer if riders come." "Thank you, ma'am." Alma smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. I got questions." She poured water from a jug and slid it across the table. "Who's looking for you?" Minnie hesitated. "A woman." "And men she paid." "White woman?" Minnie nodded. Alma sighed again, softer this time. "Then you're not the first to pass through my door." As the morning wore on, Minnie helped sweep the floors and clean the candles. The preacher returned, a quiet man named John with kind eyes and a limp that told old stories. He didn't ask much. He just nodded and said, "Every soul's got a road." Some roads got longer shadows than others. By midday, the sound of hooves came from the distance, faint but unmistakable. Alma's head snapped up. "Get under the pulpit," she whispered. "Now." Minnie did as she was told, heart hammering. The door creaked open, a man's voice, smooth, certain. "Morning. You the preacher here?" John's tone stayed even. "I am. You bringin' blessings or trouble?" "Neither. Just questions." The voice paused. "You seen a girl?" "Small thing, dark skin. Might be hurt," Alma answered before her husband could. "We seen no one but the Lord this morning." The man laughed once, low and unpleasant. "Then maybe the Lord's hiding her for you." His boots thudded across the floorboards, slow, deliberate. Minnie held her breath, watching dust fall from the underside of the pulpit as he passed. Then the door closed, and the sound of hooves faded away. For a long while, no one spoke. Finally, Alma knelt and looked under the pulpit. "You can come out now." Minnie crawled out shaking. Alma rested a hand on her shoulder. "You keep moving, child. The good Lord's got patience, but men don't. You rest too long, and they'll make your road theirs again." Minnie nodded, clutching her pouch. "I won't stop." "Good," Alma said. "Then maybe he'll let you keep what little freedom you've stolen." That night, Minnie slipped away before dawn, the church bell silent behind her, the hymn still humming in her chest. In Charleston, the Brantley house had begun to rot from the inside out. The servants whispered that the walls smelled of mildew now, though the mistress scrubbed them every morning with rosewater. The mirrors had been covered with cloth. She claimed they made her sick, that she could see her in them. The small one, the girl who had run. Mrs. Brantley no longer took breakfast downstairs. She stayed in her room, curtains drawn tight, the air heavy with perfume and decay. Her meals went untouched. Her tea turned cold. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, had become a thread that snapped easily. Edward avoided her. He had moved his things into the study and spent most nights drinking alone. The house, once so precise, had fallen into a kind of quiet disorder. Dishes went unpolished, lamps went unlit. Even the piano, the mistress's pride, gathered dust. Sarah did what she could, but she kept her steps soft, her eyes down. She knew that when a house like this began to collapse, it was best to look invisible. One afternoon, Mrs. Brantley came down the stairs without warning. Her hair was undone, her dress half-buttoned. "Where's my husband?" she asked, voice brittle. "In the study, ma'am," Sarah said. Mrs. Brantley nodded, though her eyes didn't seem to see. She walked into the parlor instead and stopped before the window. "She used to sit right there," she said, almost to herself. "The light liked her better than me." Sarah froze. "Did she cry when she left?" the mistress asked. "Did she say goodbye?" "No, ma'am." Mrs. Brantley smiled faintly, as if that answer pleased her. "Good. She wasn't meant for crying. I taught her that." Then, slowly, she turned toward Sarah. "You all think I'm cruel," she said, But cruelty is just another kind of care. I made her perfect. I gave her grace. Without me, she'd still be crawling in the dirt. Sarah wanted to say something, anything, but words felt dangerous in the room with that kind of madness. That night, Edward found his wife sitting in the dark, staring into the fireplace, though no fire burned. "Ellen," he said gently, "you have to let her go." Mrs. Brantley didn't look at him. "She hasn't gone. I hear her at night, in the hall, in the walls." He sighed. "That's your guilt talking." "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's her walking." Edward left her there, but her words followed him like a chill down the spine. He poured himself another drink and tried not to listen for footsteps that weren't there. Upstairs, the mistress sat alone in the parlor. She reached for the old lace Minnie once wore, twisting it between her fingers until the threads broke. And when the moonlight caught her face in the window pane for just a second, it looked like she was staring at someone else, someone small, someone waiting. The road north wound like a scar through the countryside, uneven, lonely, and lined with trees that seemed to lean in to listen. Minnie kept to its edges, moving when the sun was low and resting when it burned high. Her feet bled through the cloth she'd wrapped them in, but she didn't slow down. The church had been her last safe place. Beyond that, every face she met could be friend or hunter. By the third day, she'd reached a crossroads where a wagon was stuck in the mud. A man stood beside it, muttering curses under his breath as he tugged at the wheel. He was tall, with hands rough from labor and a face too tired to belong to a cruel man. "Need help?" Minnie asked quietly, though she already knew she had no strength to give. The man looked up, startled. "Lord, you near scared me half to death." Then he frowned, studying her small frame. "You out here alone, girl?" She hesitated. "Just passing through." He didn't ask more. Some men asked too much. The wise ones didn't. He just nodded toward the wagon. "If you can find some stones for grip, I might get this wheel loose." Together they worked until the wood creaked free. The man smiled faintly. "You got a name?" "Minnie." "Elias," he said. "Preacher from Dorchester way. Got a few good miles left in this wagon if you need a ride." Minnie hesitated again. "You don't even know where I'm going." Elias chuckled. "Ain't about where. It's about who's chasing. I can tell by the way you look over your shoulder." She climbed in. The wagon rattled as it rolled forward, the road stretching ahead in a long grey line. Elias didn't talk much. When he did, it was about the land, the way the crops were thinning, the rivers drying. "Whole South's sick," he said once. "Rot starts at the top, and everyone below just breathes it in." As they neared the next town, he slowed the wagon. "You best ride in the back," he said. "White folks don't ask questions if they don't see answers." Minnie crouched low under the tarp. Through the gaps, she saw glimpses of people, merchants, soldiers, mothers with children, all of them busy, all of them blind. They stopped by a small inn at dusk. Elias handed her a piece of bread and a small flask of water. "Can't take you farther," he said. "Too many eyes passed here." Minnie nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Keep north. Look for the lanterns that don't go out. They say that's where the ones who ran found a home." She stepped down from the wagon, her feet sinking into the damp earth. The wind carried the faint sound of river frogs, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel hunted. But far behind her, in Charleston, another pair of eyes was on the move. Mrs. Brantley had sent word to a man named Harlan Reeves, a name whispered even in slave quarters. He didn't chase for money, he chased for the pleasure of the catch, and when he heard the mistress's story, he smiled. "Don't you worry, ma'am," he said. "Ain't a small thing in this world that can stay hid for long." Harlan Reeves rode with the ease of a man who had never once been told no. He was tall and lean, his coat too fine for the dirt roads he took, his boots polished like he was going somewhere important, though he only ever went where there was suffering to find. He had a reputation from the Carolinas to Savannah. Some said he'd been a sheriff once, others a soldier. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that people feared him, and he liked that better than payment. Mrs. Brantley hadn't wanted to meet him at first. Men like Reeves didn't come to parlours. They came to back doors, to cellars, to places where dignity was something you could buy back later. But she'd sent for him anyway, her voice trembling just enough to make it sound like desperation instead of guilt. "I want her found," she'd said, "alive, if possible." But found Reeves smiled through the smoke of his cigar. "You sure you want her back, ma'am? Things that run once got a habit of running again." "She won't run twice," the mistress said. He'd tipped his hat and left before Edward could stop him. Now he rode north, following tracks that only someone who liked the chase could see. A footprint in the mud, a piece of torn cloth snagged on a branch. He didn't hurry. He never had to. The world was built for men like him. It bent to their cruelty and called it law. Minnie had spent 2 nights in the town Elias left her near. She'd earned a few coins sweeping the floor of a sewing shop, and the woman there had given her a shawl for the chill. But she knew better than to settle. Safety, she'd learned, was just a pause before danger remembers your name. On the 3rd night, she left again, north toward the Savannah River. The air was cold now, the moon thin and sharp. She followed the road until she saw the lights of a campfire flickering between the trees. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she approached anyway. A young black couple sat by the fire, the man strumming a broken guitar, the woman stirring something in a pot that smelled of salt and beans. "Come on, girl," the woman said when she saw her. "Ain't no one out here but ghosts and fools." "Sit." Minnie hesitated. "You don't know me." The woman smiled. "Don't need to." "I know the way you look over your shoulder." Minnie sat, and for a little while the fear dulled. They talked in low voices, about the river routes, about the families that had made it north, about the ones who hadn't. But somewhere out in the dark, miles away, a horse snorted. Reeves dismounted, crouching low, running his fingers through the dirt where the tracks were still fresh. He smiled. "She's getting slower," he murmured to himself. "That's good. Makes it easier to hear her coming." Then he mounted up, turned his horse north, and began to hum a tune, the kind sung at funerals. The night air was soft with mist, the fire's glow barely enough to hold back the dark. Minnie sat close to it, warming her hands, watching the smoke curl upward and vanish into the trees. The couple, the woman who'd called herself Dora and the man named Isaiah, talked quietly about heading west, away from the patrol routes. They spoke of the river like it was a promise, something that could wash away names and pasts alike. "You can come with us," Dora said, her voice kind but practical. "Ain't safe to travel alone, not for a child." Minnie shook her head. "I ain't a child." Dora smiled faintly. "Then what are you, baby?" Minnie poked at the fire, the embers shifting red to gold. "Something too small to keep, but too big to hide." Dora's smile faded. She didn't ask more. Isaiah looked up suddenly. "Hear that?" The forest went still. Even the frogs stopped singing. Then, faint and rhythmic, hooves on the dirt road, slow and deliberate. Minnie's heart started to race. She'd learned that sound too well, the steady weight of pursuit. Isaiah rose, hand on a rusted knife. "Get to the trees," he whispered. "Now." Dora grabbed Minnie's arm and pulled her toward the brush. The hooves grew louder, closer. Through the thin veil of trees, they saw him, a lone rider, lantern hanging from his saddle, the light swaying like an eye that refused to blink. He dismounted. The sound of the horse's snort, the metallic jingle of spurs. "Evening," Reeves called softly. His voice carried calm, like a snake carries poison. "Ain't looking for trouble. Just looking for a girl." Isaiah stepped out first. "Ain't no girl here, mister," Reeves smiled. "You sure?" "She's small, quiet. Don't talk much unless you ask real nice." Isaiah gripped the knife tighter. "Ain't seen her." Reeves took a slow step forward. "See, I don't think you'd lie to me. You don't look the sort. But that fire back there, that's small folks' fire. Traveller's fire. Not settlers' fire. Means somebody's moving. And folks that move tend to keep company with runaways. Dora whispered to Minnie, "Run when I say." Minnie's hands shook. "He'll hear." "Then don't stop," Dora hissed. Reeves's voice cut through the trees again. "Why don't you step aside, friend?" "Let me look. I don't aim to hurt nobody, don't deserve it." Isaiah didn't move. "You don't decide who deserves what out here." Reeves smiled. "You'd be surprised who lets me." He drew his pistol slowly, almost politely. The sound of it clicking was enough to send Minnie bolting. Dora shoved her forward. "Go!" Gunfire split the night, one shot, then another. Birds burst from the trees. Minnie ran until her breath tore her throat raw. When she finally stopped, the forest was silent again. No voices, no footsteps, just the smell of smoke and gunpowder drifting on the wind. She wanted to turn back. She almost did. But then she heard it. That same tune hummed soft through the trees, the one Reeves always sang when the chase began. And she knew he was still coming. Minnie ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed near a fallen tree, the bark slick with rain, her heart beat so loud she thought it might give her away. The night around her was black and deep, the kind of darkness that swallowed the world whole. Somewhere far behind her, she thought she heard another gunshot. Or maybe it was only thunder, it didn't matter. The sound was enough to make her crawl deeper into the trees until the ground turned soft and cold under her palms. She pressed her back to the trunk, clutching the little pouch that now held nothing but dirt and scraps of memory. For a long while, she didn't move. She couldn't. When the sun began to rise, she opened her eyes to see mist curling between the branches. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. No birds, no wind, no footsteps. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. She forced herself to stand, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Her feet left faint prints in the wet soil, and each one made her chest tighten. She had learned to measure safety by the distance between sounds, and right now there was too much silence. She followed the faint trickle of water until she found a creek, its surface silver with morning light. Kneeling, she splashed her face, the chill cutting through the haze in her head. She stared at her reflection, hollow cheeks, wild hair, eyes that didn't look like a child's anymore. A branch snapped somewhere to her left. Minnie froze. It wasn't a deer. The sound was careful, human. She crouched low, pressing herself against the mud, and peered through the reeds. A shape moved between the trees, tall, slow, deliberate. The glint of metal in his hand caught the light for just a second. Harlan Reeves. She bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, willing her body not to tremble. He was humming again, that same low tune she'd heard the night of the gunfire. The song of a man who never rushed because he never had to. Minnie's mind raced. The creek curved north, narrow but deep. If she followed it, it might hide her tracks. Slowly she slid into the water, the cold biting at her skin. The current tugged at her legs, urging her forward. Reeves stopped humming, his head turned, his eyes scanning the trees. Then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said softly, "You can run, little one." But every road ends somewhere. Minnie didn't wait to hear more. She pushed forward, the water rising to her waist, the sound of her breath lost beneath the rush of the current. When the forest swallowed her again, Reeves stood on the bank, watching the ripples fade. He knelt, dipped his fingers in the water, and tasted the mud. "She's close," he whispered, "close enough to start praying." The creek curved north, winding through the trees like a thin thread of silver. Minnie followed it until her legs nearly gave out, each step a fight against mud and exhaustion. Her clothes were soaked, her fingers numb, but the sound of running water comforted her. It was the only thing in the world that didn't sound like pursuit. When the sun began to set, she saw smoke curling above the tree line. Faint, steady. Not campfire smoke, but chimney smoke. She crept closer, careful with each step, until the shape of a cabin appeared through the mist. It leaned slightly to one side, built of grey wood, and surrounded by a small patch of garden gone wild. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time before knocking. The door opened to a thin woman with rough hands and wary eyes. "You lost?" she asked. "Just tired," Minnie said. "I can work for food." The woman's eyes softened when she took in Minnie's size, her torn dress, her swollen feet. "You're too little for work," she murmured. Then, louder, "Come in before the night takes your bones." Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of stew and smoke. The woman poured her a cup of water, then sat across from her at the table. "Name's Martha. My husband's buried out back, and I don't take kindly to questions, so let's skip 'em." Minnie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "You on the run?" Minnie hesitated. "I'm on my way north." Martha studied her for a moment, then reached for a loaf of bread. "Then you'll eat and rest. Ain't my business what you're leaving, long as you don't bring it to my door." For the first time in days, Minnie slept under a roof. She dreamed of rivers and voices calling her name, of firelight that never went out. When she woke, dawn was just breaking. Martha was already outside, tending to a line of traps near the creek. "You walk careful," Martha said when Minnie came to her side. "There's men downriver asking about a girl fits your shape." Said she's dangerous, Minnie's heart clenched. "He's close." Martha's eyes were steady. "Close enough, I heard his horse." The older woman looked at her a long moment. "You got anyone waiting for you?" Minnie shook her head. "Then you best make sure you live long enough to find someone who will." That night, they sat by the fire in silence. The woods outside were still, the kind of stillness that meant watching. Minnie thought of the house in Charleston, the parlor, the mistress, the cage dressed in lace. "Ma'am," she asked softly, "you ever been owned?" Martha stared into the flames. "Once," she said, "long time ago, but I gave myself back." Minnie nodded, understanding. "That's what I'm doing." Martha smiled, just barely. "Then keep running, little one. Don't stop till the land feels different under your feet." Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a horse snorted. The fire flickered once, and both women turned toward the door. The forest was quiet again, but neither of them believed in quiet anymore. It began with the sound of gravel under hooves, slow, deliberate, the rhythm of a man who knew he'd already found what he was looking for. Martha was the first to hear it. She stood from the hearth, her face pale in the firelight. "You go to the back," she said. "Through the pantry there's a trap in the floor. Get down there and don't make a sound." Minnie froze. "It's him." Martha didn't answer, but the way her jaw set was enough. She pushed Minnie toward the narrow door and dropped to her knees, prying up a loose board. Beneath it, darkness. "Stay until the night's quiet again," Martha whispered. "If I'm gone come morning, you run north till your feet give out." Minnie wanted to speak, to say thank you, to say don't open the door, but the knock came before she could. 3 measured raps, the kind of knock that sounded like a command. Martha lowered the board and stood. When she opened the door, Reeves tipped his hat. The lantern in his hand cast a long shadow behind him, stretching across the porch and onto her feet. "Ma'am," he said. "Evening." "You keep a fine fire for someone so far out." Martha's voice stayed steady. "Ain't much else to keep out here." Reeves nodded, stepping just close enough that his boots touched the threshold. "You alone? Been that way a long time?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Funny. A neighbor down the creek said they saw footprints, small ones. Could be yours, but don't seem it. Then your neighbor needs new eyes." Reeves looked past her, into the cabin. His gaze lingered on the stew pot, the second bowl, the damp footprints near the hearth. "You got company?" Martha's hand twitched toward the stove. "You think I'd be feeding someone in times like these?" Reeves tilted his head. "Depends who it is. There's a girl gone missing. Little thing. Used to belong to a fine lady back in Charleston. Says she took something that wasn't hers." Martha's voice went quiet. "Maybe what she took wasn't meant to be kept." Reeves's eyes narrowed. "You got a mouth on you." "Had to," Martha said. "World don't listen otherwise." He took one slow step inside, the floor creaking under his weight. "Mind if I look around?" "I do," she said. Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Then Reeves smiled again and tipped his hat. "Suit yourself." He turned as if to leave, then, without warning, spun back and kicked the door wide open. The lantern light flared across the room. Martha grabbed the poker from the hearth and swung. The sound of iron meeting flesh rang out like thunder. Reeves stumbled, blood running down his temple. His smile didn't falter. "Well," he said, straightening his hat, "that answers my question." Outside, his horse shifted restlessly. Inside, the fire cracked and hissed, throwing shadows that moved like things alive. And under the floorboards, Minnie held her breath as the hunter stepped farther into the cabin. The sound of boots on wooden planks echoed above Minnie's head. Slow, heavy, calculated. She could see dust drifting down through the gaps between the boards, every footstep shaking loose another fine trickle of ash and soil. Reeves' voice drawled low, almost friendly. "You swing like someone who's done it before." Martha's reply came through gritted teeth. "Don't mistake a woman's quiet for her being weak." Minnie pressed a hand over her mouth, her heartbeat slamming in her ears. Through the thin seams in the floor, she could see his shadow stretching across the room. He moved carefully, sweeping his gaze over the table, the fire, the pantry door. "See, I got a rule," Reeves said. "You don't lie to me, less you're ready to die for it. You ready, miss?" Martha didn't answer. She stood by the hearth, poker raised. The firelight flickered against her face, turning her eyes into something that looked almost young again, sharp and alive. Reeves stepped closer, his pistol loose in his hand. "I ain't here to hurt you, unless you make me. All I want's the girl, she's not yours to want." He smiled faintly, as if amused by the resistance. "You sound just like the lady that lost her, all pride and no sense. Tell me, you think you're saving her? The small ones don't get saved, ma'am. They get found." Martha swung the poker again, not wide, but clean and fast. The metal struck his arm. The gun went off, the blast filling the room with smoke and thunder. Minnie bit her hand to stop herself from crying out. The sound left her ears ringing. She saw more dust fall, felt the boards tremble as Reeves staggered back. "God damn," he hissed. "You got more fire than I figured." Martha didn't flinch. "Fire's all I got left." He lunged. The struggle was clumsy, more shoving than fighting, but desperate. The table overturned, the lamp shattered, flames licking across the spilled oil. Smoke filled the air. Reeves shoved Martha against the wall, his hands gripping her wrists. "Last chance," he growled. "Where is she?" Martha spat blood. "Gone farther than you'll ever reach." He drew his knife, the blade catching the light. But before he could bring it down, the floor creaked, loud, sharp. He froze. Slowly, his eyes turned toward the sound. The board under Minnie's foot had shifted. She went still, not breathing, not blinking. Reeves crouched, smile returning, the kind a wolf makes before it bites. "Well now," he whispered. "Ain't that sweet?" Martha saw his eyes move, and something fierce lit inside her. She grabbed the fallen poker with her free hand and drove it forward, straight into his ribs. He gasped once, a sound half growl, half laugh, then stumbled back, knocking over the burning lamp. The flames leapt up, catching on the curtains, crawling fast across the wood. "Minnie!" Martha shouted, voice breaking. "Run!" Reeves fell to one knee, blood spreading across his shirt. The firelight turned his face red and gold. "You!" he rasped, reaching for the pistol again. "You ain't done nothing but delay it." But by then, Minnie was already climbing out from under the floor, her bare feet hitting the dirt as the cabin roared behind her. She didn't look back, not when the smoke thickened, not when the heat bit her skin, not even when she heard Martha's voice one last time, shouting through the flames, "Don't stop now, girl. Don't you ever stop." The woods behind the cabin burned in streaks of orange and silver. Smoke curled low to the ground, chasing Minnie as she ran. Every breath tore her chest raw, but she didn't slow, not after Martha's voice had carved those last words into her bones. She stumbled down the slope toward the creek, the night wind slapping her face with ash and cold. Behind her, the cabin hissed and cracked as if it were alive and angry. Sparks floated through the branches like fireflies too cruel to be beautiful. She crossed the water barefoot, the current biting at her ankles. The mud on the opposite bank was soft, sinking under her weight. When she looked back, she could see the flames reflected in the creek, the cabin's ghost flickering in the black. And somewhere inside that blaze, she knew Martha was gone. Minnie sank to her knees in the grass, trembling. For the first time since leaving Charleston, she cried, not from fear, but from the sudden, unbearable truth that she was the only one left who remembered the women who had saved her. She didn't know how long she sat there. The night blurred, turning into something thick and endless. When the sky finally lightened, the smoke had thinned, and the world was quiet again, the kind of quiet that follows endings. She rose, her legs heavy but steady. Her dress was torn, her skin streaked with soot, but her eyes were clear. She walked north, following the river as it curved through the marsh, its surface glowing pale in the morning light. She didn't look behind her again. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time no longer made sense. She met travelers who asked no questions, who gave her bread, a coat, a place to sleep by their fire. One man offered to take her farther north in his wagon. She accepted, sitting silent beside him as the road wound through open country. When he asked where she came from, she only said, "South." When he asked her name, she said, "Doesn't matter." By the time they reached the border to Virginia, the world felt lighter, the air less thick, the eyes less sharp. The man pointed to a cluster of distant lights. "There," he said, "that's where the free ones go." Minnie stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered, "Ain't nobody free till they stop looking back." The man didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. Back in Charleston, the Brantley estate was silent. Edward had left. The mistress was found one morning sitting at her parlor window, her hair uncombed, her eyes fixed on the garden. She kept a doll on her lap, small, hand-carved, with ribbon around its neck. She called it Minnie, and she talked to it until her voice gave out. The house decayed around her, its walls yellowing, its music long gone. And far away, by the edge of a river she didn't know the name of, the real Minnie stood watching the water. The wind carried the smell of pine and salt. She bent down, picked up a flat stone, and let it drop into the current. The ripples spread, quiet and certain, the only sound left of a life she had refused to let anyone own. If this story held you, even for a moment, subscribe to the Macabre Record. There are more truths buried beneath the soil of the old world, waiting to be heard. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments below.